A very warm welcome to the next in our series of video interviews with technology business leaders. I'm delighted to be joined by Joe White, tech investor and entrepreneur, who today represents the UK government in the US for all matters related to the technology industry. Joe, great to see you again. How's life in California?
Hey, Mike. Great to see you. No, it's very good. It's as you can see, it's a beautiful California day. But we've survived 3 weeks of unusually torrential rain, and the city's still here. So it's nice to get back to what you'd find as traditional California weather. Though San Francisco, of course, has its own weird climate, so not always what you'd expect.
Indeed. And Joe, you've moved from being a sort of tech investor to the role of British Consul General in San Francisco and the technology envoy to the US. Tell me about the motivation for this change, and what's your mission and what impact are you having?
It's a great question. In some ways, the move was quite by accident. I've been in tech and VC, as you know, for about 25 years prior to this. Originally founding one of the early website and e-commerce platforms with a woman who became my wife along the journey, which is a whole extra double or quits story for another night, possibly with wine. But when we sold that company, we then got involved investing in the UK in early stage deep tech with Entrepreneur First, where Wendy and I raised about 200 million of funds alongside Matt and Alice, the founders there. And what then led us to California was my wife being approached by Google to come across and run part of the Moonshot Factory with the existing leadership team there, Astro Teller and folks like that. And so we moved here about 4 years ago, pre-pandemic, those innocent days before the pandemic. And I was based at Greylock. Reid Hoffman was one of our big investors in EF and continuing to run the funds globally with Matt and Alice in London. Of course, EF was operating globally at that stage, so lots of getting on planes. And when the pandemic struck, I got involved working with parts of Treasury and DCMS for a response for the tech sector more broadly. Having been an entrepreneur through the dot-com crash, through the financial crisis, and then seeing the extraordinary impact of the early pandemic across the whole economy, the issue for me, or the risk I think for all of us in the UK, was having earned our ecosystem after 20 years of hard graft, if it all accidentally got wiped out in an unexpected event like this, then that would be a tragedy. So we put together what became the Future Fund, which was this £1 billion investment vehicle, which came at the stage of the pandemic. And really, based on that involvement, I then had what became an unexpected conversation about folks saying, well, actually, now we're looking at this new tech envoy role, which is a new position for the UK government following the integrated review, which was the foreign policy statement about the UK's ambitions in the world. And having science and tech as one of the core pillars of that meant that increasing the depth of our engagement with the big tech community, particularly on the West Coast here and the broader ecosystem, was something that government was interested to potentially bring in somebody from the private sector. So for me, this felt like, you know, an extraordinary opportunity, an extraordinary city. Tech is increasingly underpinning the way that our economy as in democracies and everything works, and to improve the quality of that conversation between government and tech, I think is a critical thing. More folks should do. If you're watching this, the obvious step is entrepreneur, VC, diplomat. So remember, that's your next career path. The government needs that additional translation bandwidth. So that's what kind of brought me here. But as I said, quite an unexpected journey, but a huge privilege, and it's a great role to have.
And I suppose one of the questions I had, Joe, for you is there's been a gradual shift actually away from perhaps the Bay Area in the last few years, for many fairly well documented reasons, not only to other tech hubs, but in the US, but also globally as well. What do you think that means to the Silicon Valley long term, and what will it take for other hubs, around the world to recreate the ecosystem that has built up around the Bay Area? I'm thinking sort of Sand Hill Road, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, it's an evolving and really fascinating dynamic. I mean, in some ways, I think you've got two broad trends that will emerge from it. The pandemic clearly accelerated this. San Francisco as a city was hit particularly hard, as was the broader Bay Area, as in it's the most, in some ways, most scientifically rational part of the US and the world. And so they went early on pandemic lockdowns and they stayed in the city locked down for much longer and later. There's a lot of caution coming back. So you had this explosion of remote working. And you had some of these factors in California, which had been building for a while, including things like the tax position in the state and others. You had some companies, Tesla, HP, are fueling to move to Austin in Texas and so on, with the rise of New York as a fintech hub. You have crypto exploding in Miami, particularly in the Art Basel event just before the last pandemic Christmas, which was an explosion of all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot that's been going on there. I think so. What you're finding is this opportunity of remote work, building things differently, means that other tech hubs, both in the US and importantly in the UK, have got, in some ways, the VC mentality within Sand Hill Road is not so much it has to be within walking distance or cycling distance, as it was once known, from Sand Hill. But this whole phase of investment by Zoom call and all the rest of it has changed the way people think about the geography. Now, so I think that's the one trend, which you do have this distribution of different tech ecosystems, different pockets of tech that are going on. But the second thing, which I think is critical, is that Silicon Valley isn't going anywhere. This ecosystem has built up over 60 or 80 years, and the depth of talent, expertise, and knowledge and networks that exist here, that's still quite physical. So what we see here in terms of our role is you may have other places where things are now really happening at real scale, but everybody comes back to this ecosystem. They come back to touch base with it, to feel what's going on here, whether the VCs, some of them have distributed themselves. Some are now in Washington State. There's a bunch moved down to LA. There's a few in Miami, but everybody convenes here quite often. And so I don't think that's going to necessarily change. I think that this is a slightly different evolution than before, as in I think there is a greater understanding that these things can happen everywhere. But the depth of the ecosystem, which is Silicon Valley, isn't going anywhere. There's still that huge concentration of talent there. And I think that if you're not physically in this ecosystem, coming here, you still get something different from it. Doesn't mean you have to move here now, and rationally, even from a cost base and an engineering perspective, you may not want to. But touching base with this point, there is still a unique set of networks, people, and concentration, which is just different here. So I don't think that's going to change. So I think two slightly competing forces, but Silicon Valley, it ain't going anywhere. Rumors of its demise have been greatly exaggerated, as they would say.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you as well. As an experienced tech investor, Joe, part of your skill set is to predict what trends will stick and be transformative. I suppose, putting your investment hat on for a moment, what areas of the tech sector would you be placing your big bets on right now?
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, there's probably a few broad themes that are kind of emerging. I mean, I've always admittedly been a slight crypto skeptic, so we're definitely going through a crypto winter at the moment. I think that there will be value in there. I think that will continue to emerge. I think some of the asset fluctuation in the crypto piece, I think, is a bit more speculative. I think some of the NFT stuff was very exciting. I think there'll be some residual of that will survive, possibly within metaverse or gaming type environments for objects there. I think the distributed infrastructure will last. I think that's going through a challenging time. There's a lot of money still around, I think, and crypto money. So I think that ecosystem will keep on with itself. I think the new ones that are interesting, of course, is the generative AI piece, which has really exploded into public consciousness in the last few months. Yeah. And I think in some ways, you've got these parallel, or these multi-layered things happening here. You've got the platform capabilities, whether that's GPT-3 or Anthropic or the Google system soon to launch and all these pieces. And then you have, in some ways, the application layer that sits on top of that. And these are people building things using those platforms in ways that are pretty exciting. So even things like character AI, which allows you to talk to, effectively virtual avatars of people. You can talk to Elon Musk as a character on this thing. That's now raising or seeking to raise, $250 million at its own valuation. And that's like an application layer sitting on one of these platform layers. So I think what you find is that opening of that generative AI piece, some of the large language models, is going to create a new platform capability on which there's going to be all of this application innovation. That, I think, is one exciting trend. Yeah. I think the other one actually is really stemming and further following on from the pandemic is that the pandemic's mobilization of the biotech industry, particularly on some of these breakthrough and again platform ways, things like mRNA, what you've got is a huge investment that went globally into something like this. And what we may find that what pans out over the next, again, decade is that we've had this step change in understanding of some of these mechanisms. And again, you'll find different, in same parallel applications being built on the mRNA platform. You're already starting to see this with cancer therapies that Moderna and others are looking at now, and Pfizer BioNTech. Funny enough, the UK government has just done partnerships with both Pfizer and Moderna to look at ways of doing some of this additional development within the NHS and the UK Health Service. So I think that for me, that there's a continual biotech landscape coming, and I think there's a continued AI landscape coming. I think metaverse, to touch on one of the other oft talked about things. I think that will find its place. I think that's probably a lot longer until it has the critical mass of usership and therefore the integration into our day-to-day lives in whatever format that looks like. It'll be fascinating to see when Apple releases its device later this year, whether it upends things.
And just wanted to sort of take that a step further regarding biotech. I mean, as you know, we've worked with DeepMind and with Isomorphic Labs, great UK headquartered businesses, and they're doing some pretty amazing things in drug discovery. But if you think about areas of technology that have outside of that have the biggest impact to society, the potential to change the world, even, is there anything else that you would sort of highlight that you was worth sort of talking about? I was thinking more like agri-tech or anything to do related to ESG, anything like that you'd highlight?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, again, you're seeing some of the convergence of some of these technologies. So, the DeepMind and Isomorphic example is spot on, because you've got a pioneering AI institute that is DeepMind, which has then uses its tools to do protein folds for Isomorphic, which has then blended itself into effectively what's moving into very much AI-enabled biotech or bioengineering phases. And so what you have is that the thing which then allows us to get into different types of agri-tech, for example, in terms of crop manipulation and so on. So I think this, and then you've got the delivery mechanism of things like mRNA. So what you've got now is these different platform effects coming together to supercharge different industries. And in some ways, that's what I mean by the application layer. The way that somebody might approach this and say, well, actually, if I'm a biotech stroke AI expert innovating within the agri-tech space, how do I use the innovations of the protein descriptions that Isomorphic have provided, combined with delivery mechanisms from RNA to affect some of these things? So you've got, and this is where I think you're going to find this fertile ground of things happening. So I think the opportunity on the positive front to affect things with those is pretty enormous. I mean, you're talking about, from a health perspective, far more tailored, specific health treatments, different ways of attacking diseases like cancer and others. From an agriculture and all these areas, different ways of actually growing things. One of the things I probably have to say from a government perspective is that we're always worried about some of the unintended consequences. And what we see often is there's a lagging harms curve behind the innovation curve. And so when a new platform, new thing, we had this with the internet, we had this with social media, there's this explosion of creativity and possibility, which is wonderful. Then what you get is in some ways a lagging understanding of how to exploit those things for societal harm. So we've seen this again with social media, where the explosion of creativity and connectedness that was 2000 to 2010, 12, and then you had the weaponization of those frameworks with misinformation and spreading of these things. And I think that the risk is, as these technologies get more powerful, and who'd have thought social media could have such a powerful effect in terms of our own societal piece. But now we're talking about generative AI, we're talking about mRNA, we're talking about all of these pieces. There's a limit to how freely you want to make those things enableable, and that's the fine line the government has to try and figure out with tech businesses. So I think there's huge excitement, possibility, and of course some risks.
Yeah, of course. And turning to your role for the UK government, how has the UK's approach for developing sort of our own technology ecosystem evolved since you've taken on your role?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in some ways, my role was the creation of my role was a function of the UK's changing thinking process about its uh, role in the world and use of science and tech. So as I said, it kind of started with the integrated review, which was this foreign policy statement on how the UK needs to project itself. And one of those core pillars was being a science and tech superpower. And that document flagged the creation of my role, not specifically me, but maybe next time, as part of it. And so this role was an evolution in the UK's thinking to start with. What's happened since then is that you then had within the Cabinet Office the creation of the Office for Science and Tech Strategy, which is at a kind of official Director General level body to support the cross-departmental understanding of science and tech and how it affects the economy, the ecosystem, UK departments. And for the first time, you have a Prime Minister chaired ministerial committee, the National Science and Tech Committee, NSTC, which was created under Johnson, been carried on under Sunak, who chairs that piece. And so again, that's the first time we've had a ministerial group cross-department to look through the lens of UK science and tech advantage and to see the things that need to happen there. So what you're seeing now is the different bits of UK government which have part of a tech interest, and that ranges from BEIS, which of course has the R&D and some of the science capabilities there, through into DCMS, which has a lot of the tech ecosystem, the tech policy landscape, through to, in our case, DIT, which has the trade landscape. The UK, not as big an internal market as the US or China, therefore, to get to platform scale, we need to trade with the rest of the world. And then finally, Treasury, which of course controls a lot of the incentives and purse strings. So you're seeing this greater level of coordination, which I think is exactly right and exactly required. The UK is one of few nation states globally that could attempt the science and tech superpower bit. We're pretty much the third largest ecosystem after the US and China in this respect. And so it's an exciting change. Government, of course, takes a while to move things, but it is the oil tanker. As it starts to move in these directions, you'll see that. And there are further policies which have been affecting these things like listing rule changes or recommendations in the public markets, capital pot fee structure changes that they're looking at to try and free up more capital to flow into this kind of sector, as well as specific policies like lifts, which is a incentivization structure to build bigger funds around deep tech. So lots of good stuff happening.
And I think the last time we met in June, actually in San Francisco, Joe, we talked about what the UK economy needed to do to sort of diversify its technology ecosystem, perhaps too much of a reliance on fintech as an example. We've talked about some of the exceptional successes that we've had here in the UK, in particularly in biotech of late. What do you predict will be core to the UK tech scene, and why? Which of the areas do you think that we can really be world leaders in?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the fintech pieces, we do have a global financial center in London and in the UK. Fintech, which is really increasingly the techification of that finance process, has been something that the UK has led on and recognized globally for doing so. The other areas, I think, where we're going to see more and more activity and where we've got real expertise is, again, the biotech piece. Again, we've had this almost like wartime acceleration of that industry with the COVID response, and particularly around the Golden Triangle. Oxford's got a lot of biotech in particular that's coming through, OSE and some of those pieces there. Vacatech, which was the company behind the AstraZeneca vaccine, was partly derived through that. And so there is a lot of things there. Our genomics industry, Oxford Nanopore is a public company. There's a bunch of areas where we can build on that. And I think it's partly about us actually celebrating those successes in those different areas and continuing to drive investment into that. You've had the Mubadala Life Sciences Fund, which is a £1 billion vehicle anchored in part by HMG to kind of address that sector too. I think secondly, you've got AI, which is again clearly a piece of UK expertise. DeepMind, despite being an alphabet piece, is still a UK located research center and globally recognized and understood. You've got the research base, the Alan Turing Institute, the different universities doing these things, and the large number of UK AI enabled startups. And there's a difference between those which are adding a bit of AI in order to improve processes versus those really pushing the frontiers of algorithms, the data sets, and so on. So I think we really do have that happening as well. And for the UK to get the kind of scale platform response that I think we need to drive the economy, I'm always fascinated by the parallels. California, which is an economy a bit larger than the UK, is about to possibly overtake Germany now as the fourth largest economy in the world. Population of about 40 million versus the UK 65, and therefore the GDP per capita driven largely by the high value industries of California, tech, media, and so on. The UK has many of these things. That focus to continue to stoke that, I think, is a hugely powerful force for the future development of the UK economy. But I think we will see a stronger focus on fundamental techs. The government has settled on 5 technologies which are strategically important, which includes biotech, AI, quantum, and then semiconductors and future telecoms. The last 2 being the ones, I think, where that has more of a national security angle in particular, to make sure we can have our own supply chain and resilience there. So I think we will see fintech and the City of London continue to fuel some of this, but I think some of that will be expressed now through other harder or deeper tech industries too.
Joe, the tech sector's taken a bit of a hammering, hasn't it, in the last sort of 6 months? We went through perhaps the overheated pandemic period where things were sort of unprecedented in terms of growth, and now we've got the opposite at the moment, particularly in big tech. But historically, it's always bounced back and often stronger than before. What's your sort of near-term predictions, and what can we expect from the market when it does return?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing now is definitely an adjustment. I think that by comparison to prior adjustments, I mean, the dot-com crash, which I'm old enough to remember now, that was a sort of 70, 80, 90% cut for many of these firms. And it was either that level of cut to survive, or it was just oblivion. And that heralded in this great tech winter, which lasted for a number of years. The financial crisis was less impactful on the tech sector itself. In some ways, that was very finance and real economy based. Tech continued to grow strongly through that. And so this, I think, we're seeing an adjustment, as you said, particularly in big tech. We're seeing 6-10%-ish shavings of the workforce, but that's a dramatic difference to the 90% survival cuts we saw 20 odd years ago. And I think the thing I see most is if you look at, for example, the long-term stock charts of any of these companies, if you look over the 5 or 10 years, what you can see is the trend line, we kind of returned to trend. You had this pandemic phase where everything just went super nuts. And now even with the stock prices, they've kind of dropped back down again. And many of these companies, the big tech, are providing the commentary in their announcements that they hired very aggressively during the pandemic piece, and to a certain extent, we're seeing that adjustment. Now, so that's very real, and that obviously affects people, and there's real people losing jobs and being affected by this. But I think you're also seeing within the SF ecosystem, I don't think these people are going to be out of work for very long. There's still such that constant push of new technology and innovation. You may find that people have slightly different job setups. I think the generous packages of big tech and the liquidity of RSUs versus tied up stock options will be slightly different. But actually, that it will fuel that next phase of innovation, and that level of some of those great quality and experienced engineers will have to dust themselves up, get involved in the next generation of startups, dig in and dig through. And I think that's going to be really powerful. So I don't think this is anything like the dot-com crash. I think this is a probably needed adjustment from some of the acceleration, possibly edging towards hubris in different parts of this. But I think the tech economy is going to continue to be hugely strong. I think that if any interpretation that this was a signaling of tech decline or less tech relevance, I think would be entirely wrong. If anything, this is a return to the extremely long-term extremely strong long-term trend, just slightly off the insane trend that we had for a very few years.
Being an eternal optimist, I have to agree with you as well. And I was talking to a colleague earlier about the fact that, you know, perhaps big tech sort of could be considered decline, could also be the boost for the scale ups that, you know, clearly still have lots of room to grow. So, you know, the counterbalance could still see plenty of growth in the tech sector, even in the very short term. But Joe, look, thank you so much for your insight today. Look, really fascinating to get your perspective, both you know, as an experienced tech entrepreneur and investor, but also now working, you know, on inside the government as well. So thanks so much for investing the time, and appreciate all your insights.
Pleasure. No, very happy to, and appreciate the time. And do let us know next time you're in town.
I will do. Hopefully see you in person soon.
Great. Cheers, Mike.
Thanks, Joe.
Take care.